My hands are weak, and my head bows down under the weight of the years lived and sins committed. Despite spending the majority of my unrighteous life in prayers within the walls of the modest Abbey of Stolp, I cannot and do not wish to rely on the mercy of our Lord. The burden of my transgressions is great, and neither one nor a dozen lives would suffice to atone for them with prayers. It is the year 1180 since the birth of Christ, and today in the Abbey, the first stone was laid for one of the 3 naves of the Basilica of St. John the Baptist. To the best of my modest abilities, I assist in this godly endeavor, as I did in the construction of the Abbey walls, but I do not hope to see its completion. The weight of the winters I have lived through becomes unbearable for my weakening body. No, the end of my earthly life does not frighten me. With a calm heart, I am ready to face his stern judgment and bear the deserved punishment for my committed misdeeds. However, the secret that I have kept for many years, not even disclosing it during confession to my good brothers, burdens my soul, depriving me of sleep and rest. And so I have come to the decision to recount in these writings the story that changed my life, and after long wanderings brought me to the walls of this modest sanctuary. The story from the life of the Crusader Knight Gotthelf of Havelberg. A tale of fear, deceit, and death. A story of false trails and true demons. The story of the search for the Wolf's Castle. It was the year 1151 since the birth of Christ, and the Holy Roman Empire was far from smoothly healing the wounds inflicted in the inglorious campaign to the Holy Land. Nearly 2 years had passed since my lord and companion Walgrim, faithful vassal of Margrave Wilhelm, returned to his lands in the northern marches. Along with him, 6 knights returned to their native lands, among whom was I, Gotthelf of Havelberg. 7 warriors, 2 of whom were maimed, were all that remained of 36 knights and squires who had set out from Walgrim's lands in the Great Crusade in pursuit of glory. And let us not conceal it, a bit of fabulous Seljuk riches, which we never found. The return to the ancestral castle brought my lord scarcely less disappointment than the crusade. During his nearly 3 years of absence, a severe illness claimed the lives of both of my lord's young children and his wife. Unable to bear the grief and lacking her husband's support, took her own life. As if all this were not enough, his estates fell into decline. Bandits roamed the roads. A dispute erupted with a contentious neighbor over borderlands, and the steward, appointed to manage the fief in the lord's absence, turned out to be corrupt and, rumor has it, involved in trafficking in humans, for which he was personally executed by Walgrim, without due process, which, under the circumstances, is not surprising. However, my lord and friend showed unyielding strength of spirit, and with an iron hand set about restoring order in his lands, eradicating slave trade, and clearing the roads of villains. Of course, in all his endeavors, his comrades from the crusade were his steadfast support. We fought side by side in the lands of the Seljuks, and more than once we had to draw our swords in his own domains. Soon things began to improve, for even the mere rumor of the approach of a party led by warriors of the Lord, bearing his holy cross on their cloaks, was enough to make even the most desperate daredevils prefer an honest and sinless, albeit long life to a riotous and lawless one, but nearing a bloody end. The roads became safe again, peasants could work in peace, and villages brought in revenue as usual. The dispute with the neighboring lord, which threatened to erupt into a fratricidal quarrel against the will of God, ended in a couple of friendly scuffles and a hearty drinking bout, as squads of feudal warriors, led by Crusader knights who fought side by side under Constantinople and Damascus, came to the rescue. Thus, the land dispute was settled peacefully, not counting a few knocked-out teeth during the revelry. The autumn of that year proved to be tranquil and bountiful. My Lord Walgrim once again prospered, and instead of prayers pleasing to the Lord and battles befitting a warrior, we spent our time in idle revelry and feasts. I must admit, it weighed on me more and more, for the feasts became increasingly unrestrained, and the guests of my lord and companion grew less agreeable to me. The looks of some, and their very manners, seemed to me corrupt and unbecoming, and many of them were displeasing to me. Yet, although I had traveled with my lord through dry deserts to the very gates of Damascus and had saved his life more than once, I understood my place, and never reproached my master. Only at these feasts did I appear less and less, and when I did, I sought to leave them as quickly as possible, causing no offense to anyone. But Walgrim was an attentive and sensitive lord, and one day he summoned me to his chambers. He had often called me his right hand, so within the walls of his castle I had the liberty to go wherever I pleased, including his chambers, at any time of day or night. I did not allow myself to abuse these privileges, but at his call I appeared immediately, even if the hour was late. Seeing me, my lord rose from his seat and embraced me by the shoulders. "Gotthelf, my friend, here I am again in revelry, and you in sadness. Despondency is a heavy sin, displeasing to the Lord. Who should know this better than you?" he asked with feigned severity, casting a sly glance at me. I smiled at his friendly jest. "I am not in despondency, my lord, only in boredom. The glorious days of serving you with sword and deed have come to an end. Your fief is peaceful and prosperous, and I find no place for myself in idleness, devoting all my time to prayers," I replied, now looking at him slyly. "Might I ask for your blessing to become a monk? Idleness and prayers are more suitable for a monk than a knight." Walgrim laughed heartily, and pouring wine into a cup, offered it to me. "Drink, friend Gotthelf, until you take your vows. Although, as I know, wine is equally appropriate for both a monk and a warrior." Laughing, we drank the wine, and he invited me to sit. "I see, my friend, that idle life has become burdensome to you, and my amusements do not entertain you," he said, dropping the jests. "I remember your fierceness in battles and your steadfastness in faith. Who, if not you, can I trust my life to without fear? On whom else can I rely? Each of our comrades who fought with us against the Seljuks and the Byzantines is loyal to you," I replied without hesitation. "That is true, Gotthelf, true. And yet among them, you have always been first in bravery and piety. Will you render me one more service?" "In that lies the purpose of my life, my lord, aside from serving the Lord," I answered. He nodded, not expecting any other response. "You said it right, that my lands have been rid of evil men, but you were mistaken to think they are peaceful." He spoke cautiously. "Tell me, will you believe that the spawn of hell have tread upon my lands and found here a stronghold and a nest?" "I do not believe in the spawn of hell on earth," I replied firmly, "for I believe only in the Lord and his power. He will not allow the devil's spawn to tread upon the sacred land of the empire. All evil in the world stems only from the sins of men, who foolishly abuse the free will given to them by the Lord." Such an answer I expected from you. He smiled wryly. "That is why I summoned you, knowing the strength of your faith and relying on it." He rose and began to pace the room with heavy steps. Once a strong and mighty warrior, now the feasts and the comfortable life began to weigh on him more than before, evident in his heavy gait. For several years now, strange rumors have reached me from the northern villages. Rumors of people disappearing and monstrous demons devoid of human form. Until now, I paid them no heed, for there were more important and pressing matters, and I did not trust such rumors. But time passes, and the rumors do not cease, and I begin to wonder if there is any truth to them. I remained silent, though I already understood what he would ask of me. I understood and rejoiced in my soul that I would be relieved, if only briefly, from the dull idleness, and would once again go into battle for the glory of the Lord. Although never for a moment did I entertain the thought that demons could truly dwell somewhere in flesh. Therefore, to rid my subjects of fear, I ask you to travel north, find the source of these blasphemous rumors and deeds, and root out the evil in my land with a firm hand. I ask you again, friend and comrade, are you ready to render me such a service and face the very demons of hell, if the Almighty permits it? I stood and kneeled before him. I am ready, my lord, to serve our Lord in the battle against his unholy enemies, and to you in the defense of your lands from all evil. Excellent. He took me by the shoulders and lifted me to my feet. Excellent, Gotthelf. Take Werner and Wigard with you. Their swords have also grown idle in their scabbards, and who better than warriors of the Lord to stand against evil? And as your guide, we shall have Geltwig, who hails from those parts. Geltwig, my lord, is it wise? He is quite young. Youth is not a vice, my glorious warrior. And did you not yourself dub him a knight in Tripoli, on our way back from the Holy Land? Did he not display considerable valor in the face of the enemy? In the presence of men, yes, my lord, but you spoke of the spawn of hell. I shook my head doubtfully. Geltwig is brave and strong, but I doubt the strength of his faith, and truth be told, I sometimes regret my hasty decision to make him a knight. Where else, if not in the struggle against the enemies of humankind, is the strength of faith tested, Gotthelf? Walgrim reasoned wisely. And do you not yourself deny the very possibility of encountering the spawn of hell? Depart when you are ready, and may God be with you. Thus the question of our group's composition was settled, and it came to pass that in the first month of winter, 4 knights who had visited the Holy Land rode leisurely along a deserted trail to the northernmost outskirts of the northern march of the Empire. We had agreed to depart in a week after completing the necessary preparations and prayers. However, on the 4th day, another feast was held at the castle, one of those that increasingly wearied me, and unable to contain myself, I confided in my comrades my desire to leave the hospitable walls as soon as possible. To my surprise, Wigard and Werner readily agreed with me in this desire, and Geltwig, seeing our unanimity, immediately suggested leaving without waiting for dawn. Persuading the impetuous youth to temper his enthusiasm, we nevertheless decided to set out with the first rays of the sun, thus departing 2 days earlier than planned. We armed ourselves gloriously, paying due attention to the rumors of bloody reprisals against those who dared to resist the dark forces. Each of us rode in heavy mail, albeit taking our time to don our hoods and helmets. White surcoats with crosses were now hidden under heavy but warm furs, for the first month of winter proved cold, and the lands of the march were already covered in snow. My companions armed themselves with reliable straight blades. Geltwig and Werner each carried one-handed swords, while Wigard favored his beloved long blade, which he wielded with equal skill whether with 2 hands or 1. The leather-wrapped long handle of his sword now swayed next to his saddle by my knee. As for me, I took with me a curved saber of Damascus steel, which I had brought back as a trophy from the East. Taken for amusement, it suited me well, and I quickly became accustomed to the unfamiliar weapon of the infidels, growing to love it above all others. After brief deliberation, we decided to forego bows, but each took a pair of stout fighting knives, which, except for Geltwig, we all could throw with a sure hand more accurately, and most importantly, faster than any arrow. I also declined the crossbows offered to me. Against the unclean servants of Satan, if we were to encounter any, crossbows would be powerless anyway, and against Christians, however wicked, using a crossbow had been prohibited by the Pope several years ago. Furthermore, I must confess honestly, I regarded the crossbow as a vile and unworthy weapon for a knight, although I understood the folly of such judgments. Wiggard, who rode alongside me, had always been a stern and taciturn man, thus remaining silent. As for me, I felt no inclination for idle conversation on that day, for my soul was tormented by doubts and shame. I could not entertain the thought of the existence of infernal forces on the sacred land of the Empire, for it would mean admitting the weakness of the Lord, which was unspeakable blasphemy. Yet the rumors that my Lord had told me could not be ignored. These rumors, to my shame, shook my confidence, and the quiet conversation that Geltwig and Werner were having behind us, to which I involuntarily listened, only exacerbated my torment. They sold their souls to the very enemy of humankind, and he granted them strength and the forms of wild beasts. Geltwig fervently recounted. "Since childhood I've feared rabbits and hedgehogs," Werner replied, to whom, though he was only slightly older than the lad, joyfulness and spiritedness did not wane even in the face of death. "Or let's take squirrels. Even the thought is frightening, such dangerous and malevolent creatures." "You only care to jest," our youthful crusader exclaimed indignantly. "I tell you these are no mere fables. I've heard these legends since I was a child, and now it seems someone has awakened ancient evil, and it has returned to our lands." Ancient? But people only started disappearing a few years ago, didn't they, Gottlieb? Werner called out to me, surprised. "Rumors have it that the creatures appeared almost a year after our departure to the Holy Land," I confirmed, without turning around. "They must have realized that all of Christ's warriors had left the march," the youth declared convincingly. "So they crawled out of the coastal lands from those Wendish savages. Looks like the bear and the lion caused quite a stir among them." "I fail to see, Geltwig, what legends you could have heard in your childhood, when these creatures appeared here only 3 years ago from the savage lands." Werner's tone, repeating the word childhood, subtly pointed out Geltwig's young age, making Wiggard and me exchange amused glances. "These creatures have come recently," Geltwig insisted, "but legends have long been told in our lands, about human wolves and their forbidden castle in the woods." "Not squirrels, then," sighed the ever-cheerful Werner. "That's a pity. But perhaps foxes, eh?" Offended, Geltwig fell silent, though his silence didn't last long. Our youngster couldn't keep quiet for too long anyway. We, paternal as we were towards him for his childlike innocence and fiery spirit, also appreciated his knighthood, earned with bravery by throwing himself into the most hopeless battles with all the reckless courage of youth, which not only did not believe in death, but simply did not understand its existence. Sometimes it seemed to me that every battle was just another game for him, after which all the fallen should get up and go to feast together, even though he emerged from the fray drenched from head to toe in living hot blood and saw his comrades hacked beyond recognition. However, despite appreciating his fearlessness and zest, I could not escape the genuine fear in his voice when he spoke of the legendary human wolves. Therefore I resolved to keep an eye on him and not leave him alone to face the unknown dangers that lay ahead. We rode swiftly, though we didn't urge our horses, cloaked in their caparisons, any further, so we arrived at the village as dusk was falling. I lingered for a moment on a hill, surveying the village and the terrain before us, while my companion stopped beside me. The village was small, a dozen small houses, and almost deserted, with only wisps of smoke rising above the rooftops. Beyond it, the forest began, stretching from the outermost houses to the edge of our vision, as if intending to ensnare us in its clutches. To the north, barely skimming the dark bellies of the prickly treetops, a new snow cloud crept towards us. Even in the rays of the setting sun, the forest was grim and dark, and for a long moment, I felt as if I were truly facing a great army, ready for battle and awaiting only the command of its leader to attack. With my inner eye, I saw 4 knights, facing off against many thousands, and my heart constricted with a foreboding sense of dread. God help. Wigard's quiet voice snapped me out of my troubled thoughts. Not wanting to betray my anxiety with my voice, I waved my hand, and we set off towards the village, into the forest. We rode between the houses in the pre-evening silence, broken only by the clinking of our weapons and the snorting of horses. Shutters and doors of the houses were tightly closed, and even the peasants we had glimpsed from the hill hurried indoors upon seeing us. Only one man, apparently the local headman, emerged to meet us. "May the Almighty bless you, merciful sirs," he called out from afar, causing the horses to flinch and me to grimace. I adjusted my bear's pelt so that the peasant could see the holy cross on my surcoat, and he did see it. "Is there suitable lodging for knights and stables for our horses here?" Wigard interrupted the peasant, who had begun to offer some fearful flattery. The question, however, was futile, as neither of those could be seen in this little village, which the local elder hastened to assure us of, apologizing profusely. "Quiet," said Wigard, and the peasant fell silent halfway through his speech. "Geltwig, you're our guide," I called out to the young knight, and he and Werner rode closer. "Where can we find lodging in these parts?" "The road leads north, to the Pomeranian lands." The youth shrugged. "Not many travelers pass through here, so there are no inns. Once, the headman of the neighboring village used to provide lodging." "All right, noble knight," the elder stammered. "Old Ratvar will be happy to offer shelter to the virtuous warriors of Christ." Relief was written all over the peasant's face. He knew full well that if it were up to us, we would have ordered him to clear his own humble abode for us. However, there was still no suitable place for the horses, and I saw no suitable house for ourselves either. According to Geltwig, we could reach the neighboring village before midnight, and I reasoned that it was the most sensible decision. Before setting off, I gestured for the peasant to come closer. "Have there been any disappearances in the village in recent days?" I asked, scrutinizing his face, and I could swear I saw fear reflected in his eyes. "Noble sir." The elder averted his gaze. "Our forests are wild, dense. Those who wander too far, beasts may tear them apart." "I'm asking if people have disappeared," I insisted. "A week ago, Farvin and his son went into the forest for firewood. Farvin said they only parted ways for a short while, but the boy's trail vanished. We searched, but... Have you seen any wolves?" "No wolves, kind sir, none at all." The peasant fervently shook his head. "The boy must have wandered off, you see. Our forests are wild. If you go too far, you'll disappear," we told him. Turning away in disgust, I waved my hand, and we set our horses off in a quiet trot. The peasant's disjointed rambling was left behind, drowned out by the sound of hooves and harnesses. At the mention of wolves, the village elder turned as white as snow, but I couldn't entertain the thought that he was deliberately deceiving me. So the wolf packs were not to blame, but the mere mention of the word wolves plunged the villagers into terror. My gaze involuntarily turned to the forest, which stretched to my right, grim and dark, like a storm cloud. The sun was sinking towards the horizon, casting uneven light on the trees at its edge, but darkness lurked within. The forest grew darker with each passing minute, creeping closer in the thickening twilight. "This ride is getting boring," Werner suddenly snapped out of his reverie. "Gotthelf, look how dark it's getting already, and the forest is right there. It's the perfect time for your tales." "It's not the right time," the young man replied cautiously, squinting at the trees, "to talk about such things at night." "Huh? Why are you being so cautious? Scared now?" Werner taunted him. "Even in the darkness, it's clear how fear has changed you, huh, Wigard? You look just like that ragamuffin in the village, I tell you. And I wasn't scared at all," our kid immediately retorted. "I'll tell you everything I've heard, and then we'll see which one of us shits his pants off." "Oh, it's been a while since I was scared like this," his companion persisted. "Last time was near Damascus when news came that Nur ad-Din's army was on the march." "Then there was something to fear," I interjected gloomily, frustrated not so much by the inappropriate cheerfulness as by what I heard beneath it. Werner's concealed apprehension behind his jests and the genuine fear in the voice of the previously fearless Geltwig. Even Wigard's usual grim silence seemed filled with unfamiliar unease. Yes, there was. But back then, Geltwig still appeared more boldly and combatively compared to how he looks now, Werner responded, hoping to get a response from the youth, but my grim tone seemed to call them both to order. But he's right. We need to start somewhere. Wigard unexpectedly spoke up, and I looked at him in surprise. We might as well hear what he has to say. After some thought, I couldn't disagree with my usually silent comrade. Superstitious fears are a weakness that a warrior of the Lord must avoid even in his own heart. And I myself am fostering these fears in the minds of my companions with my grim demeanor. However, knowledge of local legends could lead us on the right path. Rebuking myself for not coming to this realization earlier and not questioning our guide about it sooner, I nodded. "Well, splendid!" Werner cheered up again. I was starting to get bored. "Tell us, noble Geltwig, about the adventures of the demon in your lands." "Oh, what joy! I dreamed of returning home as a warrior and knight, but I came back as a storyteller and jester," the youth lamented, but dared not disobey. "They say that deep in the forest, on a low cliff, there once stood a monastery where monks and their novices transcribed ancient books. Among those writings were the godly ones, multiplying in glory to the Lord and spreading true faith to other lands. And there were vile books, preserved and transcribed only to preserve the knowledge of the wicked, like a doctor preserving knowledge of diseases in order to treat them and teach other physicians." "Geltwig, put down your sword, take off your armor," Werner exclaimed admiringly. "A splendid minstrel you'll make." The youth veered his horse aside, nudging his companion. Werner waved his hands, indicating his readiness to listen to the storyteller all night long. "In one of those nefarious books, Brother Rudolph, the keeper of the monastery library, found a description of a vile ritual which promised unearthly power and long years of life to those who performed it. And finding it, he fell into great temptation, for he was strong of body and full of life. But many years weighed heavily on him. His body lost its strength, his hair turned gray, and he felt the approaching twilight of his life. Tempting others secretly, he succeeded, for the unclean one granted him the power of persuasion. For nothing pleases the father of lies more than the sinning of the righteous. And thus arose in the holy place a secret, wicked coven, consisting of 12 apostate brothers with Rudolph at the helm. Then people began to disappear in the surrounding villages, for to perform the godless ritual, living human hearts were required, and the younger the heart, the more strength and years of life the perpetrator of the wicked act gained. The monks realized too late that a devilish mass was being prepared within the monastery walls. On the night when the full moon rose above the monastery bell tower, they were awakened by a loud noise. Rising in alarm, the brothers discovered that the holy relics were gone, and from the cellars beneath the monastery came terrible screams and howls like those of wolves. Our storyteller's voice gradually faded away as he told us the legend, and now it was barely audible over the sound of the snow crunching under the hooves of the horses. The forest, as if unwilling to miss a single word of the dark story it had kept secret, drew closer, and Geltwig kept casting glances into the darkness between the bare trees. I shook myself, banishing the images from my mind, inspired by the words of our young companion. Snow fell from my shoulders as I moved, and I realized that we had been riding under swirling flakes for some time now. I recalled the cloud creeping from the north, and I thought it would be difficult now to trace the tracks of the villains, whoever they might be. So what happened next? Werner spoke for all of us. Did the wolves tear them apart? There were no wolves in the cellar, the youth replied grimly, once again throwing a quick glance towards the forest. When the abbot opened the doors, he saw, and once again, our eloquent storyteller fell silent, as if afraid to speak aloud what he had heard in his childhood. You are a warrior of Christ, Geltwig. I couldn't contain my annoyance, though I understood that I was more annoyed with myself for doubting and fearing than with our young companion. His holy cross is emblazoned on your garments, and your sword is blessed by the holy fathers of our church. It is not fitting for a warrior of the Lord to tremble before old wives' tales. I have heard no fear in your voice, seen no hesitation in your actions until now. Truly I regret calling you a knight. I fear neither men nor death, and you know it well, Brother Gotthelf. The youth flared up, calming his prancing horse. But even the most worthy are powerless against the machinations of the devil. Finish the tale, Geltwig. Werner couldn't help himself, though it was evident that even he felt uncomfortable with the dark legend and the proximity of the silent, nocturnal forest. You've been told that the knowledge necessary for our mission is here, so tell it as it is. The abbot witnessed desecrated sanctities, bloodied human hearts, and unholy scripts on the floor and walls. Yet all this paled in comparison to the beings howling and writhing in agony in the midst of the cellar. Their bodies were covered in fur, their limbs twisted, and their faces turned into bestial snouts. Before the horrified eyes of the monks, the dissenters transformed into monsters, half human, half wolves, for such was the form the evil one chose as a vessel for beastly strength and inhuman longevity, though the malevolent book failed to mention this. The most deceived among them was their leader, a mighty beast with a gray streak on its wolfish snout. Instead of repentance, which could have saved their souls if not their bodies, the apostates fell into a bestial fury and attacked their holy brothers, unleashing a terrible massacre within the monastery walls. Only a few novices and monks managed to escape from the devil's spawn in the darkness of the night. Thus the story of this sinfall became known. Within the temple, the human wolves committed dreadful atrocities, desecrating the holy crucifix by stripping the monks, nailing them to the cross, and tearing them apart with their fangs and claws while still alive. And so, the Lord's patience was filled. An unprecedented storm unleashed over the cursed monastery thereafter, with blinding lightning striking the bell tower and buildings, collapsing entrances and exits. Books in the library and oil in the storerooms, along with wooden beams and structures, ignited, erasing the traces of abomination in purifying flames, and the vaults collapsed on the heads of the godless monsters, burning them alive. For though the storm raged around the monastery, not a single drop of water fell on the fire by the will of the Lord. Thus ended this tale, and that place deep in the forests forgotten, its paths overgrown, now called Wolf's Castle, for on its ruins wolf packs howl at the full moon, mourning their kings who almost breached the divine realm through human greed and fear. Geltwig fell silent, and so did the others, and in this silence, I suddenly felt the weight of the Holy Cross on my chest. Though it was only paint on fabric for the eyes, it became a heavy burden for the spirit. Can I believe in the nest of hellspawn on the sacred land of the Empire? Again I recalled the fear that gripped the peasant when I mentioned wolves. My companions remained silent, lost in thought, and so was the forest, and I felt as though I could sense an evil gaze from the darkness, a gaze that clouded my thoughts, and once again tightened my heart in the grip of ominous premonitions. But splendid tales, by thunder! The indefatigable warrior continued to marvel, casting a wary glance at the now heavily snowing dark sky, and well told. So it all ended there, Geltwig? The hellspawn burned, and that was that? The legend ends there and rumors begin? Sighed the youth. Well, that's good, since we can't see the village yet. Werner shifted in his saddle. Keep going. Some say that the leader survived that night. Either he chased after a fleeing monk before the storm broke, or he locked himself in the monastery cellars and waited out the fire. Others claim that all the monsters perished, but the malevolent book remained in the stone cellar, untouched by fire. Supposedly it was found by wicked men, greedy for power, who then performed the ritual again. Whether true or not, whenever someone disappears in this forest, they say that the human wolves took him, needing human hearts to extend their life and replenish their unholy strength. In these woods, disappearing is easy even without demons. Werner snorted. If beasts don't tear you apart, you'll just get lost. And it wasn't that common for people to disappear until recently, Geltwig mused thoughtfully. But now, see, even Lord Walgrim has heard such rumors that he didn't send hunters to drive the wolves out of the woods, but a quartet of crusading knights. The Lord knows best who to send, I said dryly. No one responded, and we once again immersed ourselves in the rustle of snow under the hooves of our weary horses and the quiet creak of trees in the darkness of the night forest. To my companions I recounted the rumors that Lord Walgrim had told me, that in recent years people have been disappearing in these woods more and more frequently, and it was no longer possible to blame deceptive forest paths and wild beasts. The last straw was a few days ago when 2 children disappeared near a village, and their father, who had gone with them, was found brutally murdered. It was then that the peasants from the villages pleaded for protection and salvation from the dark forces. I did not mention one detail. The slain peasant was found naked, shamelessly crucified on the branches of nearby trees, in a blasphemous imitation of the crucifixion. And he was terribly torn as if by claws and fangs of beasts. I chose not to tell them this at the time, and now I certainly did not wish to, so as not to sow undue fear in their hearts. But it seemed impossible to avoid this now, after the young knight's tale. However, not now. Not in the darkness of midnight. Enough of ghastly tales and legends for today. What about it, Geltwig? Werner began, evidently intending to request more tales for entertainment. But Wigard suddenly interrupted him. A settlement, he uttered, wearily waving his hand in a chainmail glove, and spurred his horse. Indeed, ahead appeared the dark masses of buildings that could be nothing other than the homes of a new village. Soon we were riding down a street between houses that were sturdier and larger than those in the village we had previously visited. The home of the local headman was easy to find, for it was the largest and surrounded by sheds and structures promising rest for our weary mounts. It was late, and the elder Ratvar did not appear at our knocking for some time. When he did appear and learned that we had arrived by the Lord's command, he showed no great joy, for he dared not ask us for payment for lodging. Yet the name of Walgrim and the crosses on our cloaks did their work, with the elder himself leading our horses to the stables, and his wife ushering us into a guest house, which stood a bit apart from the headman's own home. The house was small and cold, but soon there was a brazier and torches, and the elder's wife served us a late cold dinner without stinting, so we were not left wanting. When we finished our meal, which passed in weary silence, we had strength only to stretch out on straw mattresses and fall into a dreamless deep sleep. In the morning, Ratvar brought water for washing and laid out breakfast, and I began to question him about what was happening in the village and the surrounding areas, hoping to learn a bit more than from the peasant we had met yesterday. The local elder looked older and far calmer than the others, which gave hope. Ratvar, Lord Walgrim, has heard disturbing news of evil deeds occurring around this forest. I began as cautiously as possible, fearing to alarm this man as well. Evil deeds, Herr Gottlieb? The elder responded unflappably. Did you not send someone to the castle with a complaint about people disappearing in the forest? Oh. Ratvar seemed surprised. I sent no one, sir. But perhaps someone else took it upon themselves. Have you had people disappear? Children, my lord. Children. Late last autumn, just before the snow, Bernhard's daughter did not return from the forest. The man sat down on a bench by the hearth. She and her mother were collecting firewood and got separated. We never found her. How many children have disappeared in the last 3 years? 12, Ratvar answered without blinking an eye. And 2 peasants were torn apart by beasts. And you didn't report this to the Lord? Werner frowned. I did not wish to become the third, good sirs. The elder gave us a penitent bow, but it was clear he did not see himself as bearing much guilt. Whom are you afraid of? I asked grimly. The elder averted his eyes, doubt on his face. Hard to say, Herr Gottlieb. The Lord did not bless me with children, and I have lived through many winters, so I speak with you without fear. Yet I would not wish to die a slow death in the claws of wild beasts. And I can tell you little. But you, I see, already know everything. Then who knows more than you? Whom should we ask? The elder hesitated, doubting even more than before, but then gathered his courage. Herr Gottlieb, he rose, bowing again. If one needs to know what no man can know, we go to Runwalde. But is it fitting for you, warriors of the Lord, to sully yourselves by speaking with a soothsayer? That we will decide? I cut him off. Look, Ratvar, if we learn you've hidden something from us, we will return. As the Lord pleases, the elder responded without much fear. But even then I could not tell you more than what has been said. I let him go, and he had just opened the door when Geltwig called out to him. Do you only allow lodging? Are there others who provide shelter in the surrounding villages? I asked. I haven't heard of such, Sir Knight, but there have been travelers who declined my hospitality and chose to continue on their way, even at a late hour. It seems that Alvin, the elder of the village further along the track, allows others to lodge there. It's curious, Werner spoke up, waiting until the elder had left. Who then brought the news to the castle if here everyone is afraid to speak a word too many? We'll inquire in other villages, I responded. Regardless, we must visit them all and find out. Finish your meal and let's hit the road. Along the way, we'll visit this. Runwald. The soothsayer's house stood slightly apart from the village and was surprisingly small and cramped, which pleased me, as I did not wish to lead my companions into unholy communion with a godless witch. Still, it occurred to me that it would be unwise to go alone, for who knows what devilish enchantment she might cast upon my mind. Though it seemed a weakness to doubt the power of the Holy Cross on my surcoat, and to entertain the thought that a godless woman could overcome its protection, it would also be undue pride to consider myself a bearer of the Lord's irresistible force. Thus reasoning, I looked to the companion I deemed most reliable of my three fellows, in whom I had already placed my trust multiple times. Wiggard kept his eyes on me, and meeting my gaze, simply nodded and drew his long sword. Some might think that, expecting combat, it would be wiser for a warrior to bring a fighting knife, like the one strapped to my shin, or a faithful hatchet with a short handle, like the one now hanging at Wiggard's hip, into the cramped dwelling. But such reasoning overlooks two important truths. The first is that few knives or axes command attention and instill fear quite like the noble gleam of a knight's blade. And Wiggard's sword, with its unusual length and shape, attracted stares and instilled fear particularly well. The second reason I did not think to stop my companion was that I had seen his skill with this blade and knew well that should we have to fight inside the house, the length of the sword would not be a hindrance, and the knight's strikes would be as swift and deadly as in the midst of an open field. Therefore, leaving Werner and Geltwig to stand guard, we approached the soothsayer's house together. Wiggard carried his sword, laying its flat side on his shoulder as he always did when expecting close combat, but not yet seeing the enemy, and upon reaching the house, he deftly shifted it to the crook of his arm. Near the door, my friend held me back with a hand and pointed to his eyes. Nodding, I placed one hand on the weather-beaten and rain-worn wooden door, and with the other I covered my eyes to acclimate them from the sunlight and snow glare to the gloom that undoubtedly awaited us inside the soothsayer's dwelling. To anyone who might think we were overly cautious in approaching a meeting with a mere woman, I say this. I have seen many reckless braves, and few of them have lived to my years. With soothsayers and other bearers of blasphemous knowledge, a warrior must be ever vigilant. When darkness gathered under my eyelids, I pushed the door, stepped through the small anteroom, and entered the room, ducking under the low lintel of the doorway. The house was indeed dark, but for eyes prepared, the light from the hearth in the far corner and a small window was enough to make out a small table with a piece of white cloth on it to the left of the entrance. I also saw a bent figure seated behind it, wrapped in dark fabrics and worn furs. Upon entering, I stepped aside, and Wiggard instantly stood beside me. "I was expecting you, warriors of the Lord," the crone said in lieu of greeting. However, her voice did not seem to me the voice of an old woman, but was instead strong and deep. "You wait for everyone who enters," Wiggard replied disrespectfully, and I gestured for him to be silent. If anyone was to defile themselves with conversation with a hag drowned in devilish sorcery, it was me, as the leader. At my sign, the knight moved to the far wall and leaned against it in a seemingly carefree, relaxed pose, comfortably arranging his blade in the crook of his arm. This relaxation, as I well knew, was deceptive, promising a strike that was instant and deadly. "I need answers, woman," I said as sternly as I could, to make it clear that we were not here to play her games. A warrior of Christ, who walked in distant hot lands and returned to our snows. A believer, yet not believing. "You come for answers you already know," the soothsayer chuckled softly. "But are you aware of the right questions?" I couldn't discern her face behind the rags and furs she was wrapped in, her hands folded near her lap. The flickering flames and dancing shadows in the room made her hands appear now youthful, now aged, as she gently rocked a cloth bag in her palms. I could not determine her age by her hands. The skin was white and thin, fingers long. "Speak not in riddles to me, Runvalda," I replied, averting my gaze from the bewildering play of light. You will tell me all you know, or I shall ask with steel." "I will tell you what I know, warrior," she said after a pause, "but not out of fear. Though you think your companion could end my life with but a sign from you, I know I will not perish by blade, nor arrow, nor human hands. Each of us has our fate. For you, wolves and snow. For me, dogs and fire. Enough with weaving words and confusing our minds." I raised my voice, and Wigard behind the soothsayer fixed his gaze on me, awaiting a sign. "Tell me, do you know of Wolf's Castle? How can we find it? I can only tell what I know, and what the gods reveal to me. I had a vision this night, and it was told to me that you know where the den of vice is, but I do not. There is only one god, woman, and those you call gods are demons, and you will be held accountable for communing with them. Now answer, who takes the children and youths with maidens from the surrounding villages?" I asked again, nodding at Wigard, who significantly ran his finger along the blade of his sword. Torture might force answers, indeed, but are they truthful? Torture often makes people speak not the truth, but what the tormentor wishes to hear. And it is not fitting for the Lord's warriors to behave as godless barbarians. For now, the wolves will come for you, sparing no flock, the soothsayer murmured softly. But Wigard and I heard every word. The werewolves come for them, those who have renounced their human guise and now, like wolves snatching their prey, spill blood, take lives to gain their prize. Are these truly the legendary werewolves? Monsters in wolf's guise harboring human malice? That I do not know, but I do know that you, warrior, and no one else may see the true faces of the werewolves. As for the wolves, my vision told me this. Not every wolf has wolf's teeth, not every human has a human face. Let him who has ears hear. You have revealed nothing to me, I said. You speak nonsense and distract us with empty words. You speak in riddles to lead us astray. Those above speak in riddles. I can only interpret them to the best of my abilities, Runvalda, undaunted by my stern voice, as if truly believing herself safe even with an armed knight behind her. I can only show the way as it is known to me. She lifted the bag, from which came a wooden clatter. I can divine, as our ancestors did long ago, and seek advice from higher powers. Such is the power granted to me. But do you wish it? My soul was not inclined towards unholy games, and I almost voiced this aloud, but my companion surprised me. Let her, he suddenly said. Let her divine. I looked at him in astonishment, and even Runvalda seemed to flinch in surprise at the sound of his voice. Let her babble, my friend clarified in response to my questioning look. It does us no harm, and perhaps by divine will, she might inadvertently reveal something she now wishes to hide. Not directly, then by hints. If we're not intending to question her otherwise, let her at least speak freely. Your friend gives wise counsel when he decides to speak. The soothsayer giggled and shook the bag. So, brave knight, dare you pose your question to powers beyond beasts and men? Do as you will, woman. But remember, as we leave, so we may return one day. And we will demand retribution tenfold for every falsehood you've spoken today. Not a word of falsehood have I spoken, the soothsayer shrugged, her bent figure betraying no fear. And returning to my home is a fate you shall not be granted. Before we could muster a reply, she overturned the purse over the white linen spread on the table, and from it fell wooden discs the size of a coin, but thicker. They landed in disarray upon the fabric, yet not a single one rolled off the table. I vaguely recalled similar divinations, and it seemed to me that the discs ought to bear runes, yet those pieces of wood lying on the fabric before Runvalda were clean. "You must choose 3, and by them I shall divine your fate," the fortune-teller croaked, and for the umpteenth time I could not discern her age by her voice, for now she creaked and croaked like an old woman, then spoke with a voice deep and soft, as though she were a woman in her prime. With doubt, I gazed upon the scattered wooden pieces and could not decide. Vigard was right once again. We should gather all the words that can be spoken, all that can help us, and only when that proves insufficient should we resort to other inquiries. Yet, I did not wish to sully my hands and soul with godless divination. Once more, my companion came to my aid. "How convenient that there are 3 of us here," he said quietly. "1 trinket each, correct?" Before the old woman could object, the blade of his sword whispered past her ear and pressed its sharp point into one of the wooden discs on the table. "This one shall be mine." Runvalda did not flinch, even though the blade was close to her neck, merely tilting her head. "You do not know what you are doing, warrior of the Lord, intertwining 3 fates into one and binding them with a single thread. Until this moment, as you entered, so you could leave, walking by your own will. But if I choose with you, I become the herald of our fates, and none of us shall escape them. Are you certain you wish for this?" "Speak," the warrior replied with a bored voice, returning the blade to its previous place. "Speak, fortune-teller, until they come for your soul." I nodded, agreeing with his decision, for even though it was abhorrent to God what we were now partaking in, fleeing from here in fear of the empty words of a crooked old woman would be a disgrace to both knightly honor and true faith. Runvalda took the disc the blade pointed to and flipped it over. On the backside, indeed, was a rune drawn in black. "Tewaz," the fortune-teller croaked and laughed hoarsely. "Do you know what it signifies, knight?" Vigard twitched his cheek, as if wanting to repeat his speak, but remained silent. Runvalda, as if hearing the unspoken, nodded and continued. "For our ancestors, this rune signified the name of the supreme god Tyr, who was the bravest and most honest. And Tyr was one-handed, not because of bravery, but because of honesty." "I wish Werner was here," I sighed in mock boredom. "He would have delighted in these tales." "The gods decided one day to bind Fenrir, the terrible wolf, for his strength had grown too great and his nature too wild, and he tore through all bonds and escaped from all fetters. Then the dwarves forged a special chain for them, one that Fenrir could not break, and the gods began to boast of it, arousing his curiosity and pride. They offered the wolf to test the magical fetters, but the beast was cunning and suspicious, agreeing only on the condition that one of the gods put his hand in his mouth. Only then would he allow himself to be bound. And Tyr, whose honesty was known to all, agreed and placed his hand in the mouth of the wolf, which he himself had raised, for others feared him, and thus Fenrir was bound. Realizing that he could not break the chain, the beast flew into a rage and clamped his jaws shut. Thus Tyr became one-handed, but he was ready for that sacrifice to pacify the maddened wolf. "The interpretation of this tale is clear to me," I said. "You prophesy maiming for the night, seeking to disturb his spirit? Where gods lose a hand, mortals pay with their lives." Runvalda hissed, puffing up like a raven. "How many lives are you prepared to place in the wolf's maw to tame the beast?" "Risking life is nothing new for a warrior," Vigard said serenely, shifting his grip on his sword. "Now you choose, old woman, and make it entertaining." Runvalda did not argue, extending her hand towards the discs, but her hand trembled at the last moment. "One who knows does not divine their own fate," she said softly, and once again her voice did not resemble that of an old woman. for I can interpret it for others, but my own is closed and incomprehensible to my mind. But now, who knows? She timidly closed her slender fingers around one of the discs and flipped it over. Upon flipping it over, she screamed in disgust and cast it aside as if it were a loathsome insect, and the disc fell on the table, revealing to us the image. "Kenaz!" Runvalda spat out and shook her head. "Kenaz! The torch! Fire and dogs from my visions! I know not its meaning and wish not to know. But now I am indeed bound to the fate this rune heralds, and I cannot escape it." She fell silent and raised her face to me, and beneath the furs I could make out her chin and lips and a strand of hair. And again, I could not determine her age. Her chin was white in the shadows, her lips were sternly and sharply outlined, and the strand of hair gleamed gold in the darkness. But I cannot say I remembered it well, for the firelight's glimmers and the shadows of the cramped room were deceptive. I looked at Vigard, and he shrugged as if to say, "Why not play along? What harm could it do?" Here was a man whose faith was steadfast, and no tale could disturb his tranquility. Sighing, I pointed to the disc nearest me, lying a bit apart from the others, on the edge of the white linen. Runvalda reached out, flipped it over, and we saw the third sign. "Rido," the fortune-teller read. "The journey. Well, so be it. You came to learn the path to the wolf's castle, but the gods prepare no single path for anyone, for each is free to choose. Thus before you, knight, lie two paths. The first is the path back from whence you came. Though it leads to the wolf's castle, you will not soon find it that way, and whether you find it at all, I do not know, but the werewolf you will not avoid. The second path is forward, and it will become your fate if you choose it. It takes you away from the wolf's castle, but will lead you to it sooner than the first, and you will see it on the night of the full moon." The bent, dark figure at the table curled up even more, her voice now truly becoming that of an old crone, as if a crow were speaking. "But everything has its price, and on the second path, you will lose friends, break your oaths thrice, betray your God and Lord, and yourself, and you will come to despise yourself. The first path is questions without answers. The second, answers you would not wish to know. Death circles around you, warrior, and those who have forsaken human form follow in your wake, and you will meet the werewolf at the end of each path. But those meetings will be different. Choose, knight. I have nothing more to tell you." Vigard and I exchanged glances, and I saw a grim sparkle in his eyes, but I did not want to resort to undue cruelty. Not yet. We left the fortune-teller's house in silence. Vigard, upon leaving, ran the blade of his knife across the tabletop, leaving a long scratch on the darkened wood as a memento for Runvalda. At the door we squinted in the sunlight, glanced at each other, and at our companions nearby, leisurely sparring with their swords, showing each other moves. I looked into Vigard's eyes and nodded, and he nodded back almost imperceptibly, once again reading my thoughts, as happens among warriors who have fought side by side for many years and know each other's habits well. It was unnecessary to tell our young companions about what we heard from Runvalda. They need not hear about lives to be laid in the wolf's maw, nor about friends I am destined to lose. Enough with Geltwig's terrifying tales of werewolves. The fortune-teller's idle chatter would not strengthen the spirit of a young crusader. Therefore, when we approached our companions, I brushed off questions about the conversation with the fortune-teller, saying only that Vigard and I had heard another heap of old wives' tales. And at that moment, I thought I had not strayed far from the truth. Yet, she told us where to go. I smirked, settling in the saddle. Around the forest, to the north. Oh, the Hansa, Werner immediately feigned dismay. I might well have become a fortune-teller myself, for that path also seems predestined to me. Indeed, I saw no other path but to ride through all the villages near the forest and learn all that was possible about the disappearing people. If it were the Lord's will, he would show his warriors the true path and lead them to the source of devastation. And if not, then it would be time for a new conversation both with the elder, who speaks little and fears who knows what, and with the fortune-teller, who speaks much but only confuses minds and tells abominable tales. Then they would be questioned thoroughly, and who knows, perhaps they would speak differently than now. Before setting off, we went to the elder's house to dine and wait out the snowstorm, but the snow showed no signs of stopping, so after noon we decided to set out. It fell thickly, and the horses struggled to lift the white expanse, so we walked in single file, frequently changing the lead. The wind from the fields whipped up a thick drift, and our tracks were quickly covered, the low-hanging clouds aiding in this, burying us in prickly flakes as best they could. Surveying the storm brewing around us, I prayed silently for divine assistance and a clear sign to aid our quest. Little did I know then how much I would come to regret those thoughtlessly uttered prayers, unaware of what I was truly asking for. We entered the village as dusk was setting in, immediately sensing recent turmoil. Many peasants had gathered in small groups outside, discussing something despite the bad weather. Werner asked one group what had happened, and they told us of a raid on the village that night, causing terrible devastation. No one could say who the attackers were. They just turned pale with fear and fell silent, much like the elder of the first village who had turned whiter than snow at the mention of wolves. Urging our horses on, we rode to the other end of the village where the peasants pointed us, finding a larger gathering of people near one of the houses on the outskirts. As they saw us, the peasants quickly dispersed, leaving only a tall man with a thick graying beard and a young man who bore a resemblance to him. The man was quietly explaining something to the youth as we approached. The boy replied as if scared, but the father just gave him a stern look from under his bushy eyebrows. "Who here is Alvin?" I called out, dismounting. "I am, sir," the bearded man responded, bowing, then added, addressing his son, "Go on, then. Spread the word." The youth bowed to his father and me and hurried off. "What has happened here?" I asked the elder, who hesitated, bowing as if unsure whether to speak. "Well, at night, sir," he began unclearly. "We did not see who it was. Speak clearly." "It was Wolvig, the woodcutter's house. Unknown fiends attacked." "People," the elder managed, bowing and avoiding eye contact. Alvin spoke strangely, as though through clenched teeth, always trying to bow his head. "How many people are missing?" "Wolvig himself, his wife, and 2 children, a boy and a girl, close in age." "Was anyone in the house? Did anyone go in?" "No, sir, we dared not." This was evident from the untouched snow that had covered any tracks in front of the house since nightfall. "What happened at night? Did you see anything?" "There was a great noise, screams, and in the elder dragged on. "We do not know, sir. We saw nothing." "So, no one went out to the noise? To help your neighbor?" "Not even at dawn, went into the house." "We are but simple peasants, sir," the elder mumbled, bowing even lower and averting his eyes. I turned away from the groveling coward and looked at my comrades who had gathered around. Their eyes burned with that fire that ignites in hunting dogs when they catch a beast's scent. Here before us were the traces of evil, a divine providence, no doubt. My prayers had been heard, and a trail was given to us, only to be followed, to seize the destroyers by the throat and exterminate them. I had no doubt that the strength of 4 warriors of Christ would suffice to cut down a band of forest marauders, accustomed only to preying on peasants. We need to inspect the house, Werner said impatiently, eager to see what traces were left, perhaps find some definite signs. That's right, I nodded, cooling his ardor, but we won't all barge in at once, lest we cause even more chaos. Here's what we'll do. I'll go into the house, see what there is to see as cautiously as I can. The rest of you examine the road. Though it's been trampled by the villagers and snow has been falling since morning, still look for tracks that seem odd to you. The attackers didn't fly away. They left on foot and took the villagers. Look, Vigard, check the road to the north, towards the track. The peasants have walked there the least. But don't go far alone. Werner and Helvig, you two scour the village together, look sharp. There are many foreign tracks, but by God's grace you might find something. If we find out which way they went, that's a big deal. God is with us. God is with us, my friends responded, and we dispersed in different directions. As I thought, not a single track marred the snow covering the path leading to the porch. It was swept clean, buried under snow, indiscernible. However, to see the devastation, one did not need to approach the house closely. The front door had been torn from its upper hinge by tremendous force, hanging crookedly on the lower bent hinge, leaning into the house. The marks on the wood were clear, and no snow could cover such traces, deep scratches as if made with spikes or nails, or claws. My heart raced, and I understood why no one had dared to enter the house until now. The local peasants' fear of wolves was as strong as it was inexplicable. Removing my glove, I ran my fingers over the deep grooves in the doorframe and door. Fear of wolves. Or should I at least in my heart call these creatures by their true name, those that prowl these woods? To admit that this very night, mere miles from us, blasphemous creations of the devil, werewolves, had burst into a peasant's home and slain subjects of the Holy Roman Empire. Runvalda's words came back to me. A night believing, yet not believing. To believe or not. Carefully shaking the snow off my boots, I stepped into the house. Deep scratches covered the walls as well, visible on the table and benches that had been overturned and scattered throughout the home. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed a stain on the floor that could only be blood. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath caught, for although there was little blood on the floor, it was enough for someone to have left footprints. These footprints were such that I firmly decided not to let Helvig into the house, for they were prints of paws, akin to those of dogs or wolves, but much larger. A single print was as big as two of my hands, and by their arrangement I could tell that the creature who left these prints did not run on all fours. Werewolves, men turned wolves. See, Gottlieb, and ponder. Do you believe or do you have faith? Not much time had passed before Vigard entered the house with a torch he had demanded from the elder. With the light, the traces of devastation became clearer. We also found several tufts of gray fur, leaving no doubt it was wolf hair. With a heavy heart, I stepped back into the fading daylight, only to exchange a knowing look with Vigard as our companions approached. Nothing, Gottlieb. Helvig shook his head, glancing at the dark doorway behind us. Not a trace or sign that hasn't been trampled or covered by snow. The same here, Vigard nodded in agreement, and together we subtly steered Werner and Helvig away from the house where the night's devastation had occurred. Impossible to tell where they went. What's in the house? Werner, ever curious, took a step towards the doorway, but I stopped him. Nothing. Blood and devastation, but nothing clear. So we missed them? He exclaimed in frustration, kicking the snow beside the road. The villains abduct peasants right under our noses, and we're like blind dogs, sniffing at the air. Here's what we'll do, I said firmly. hoping to instill a fighting spirit and confidence in the young comrades that I myself did not feel. We'll split into pairs and go both ways along the track. Vigard and I will head north, where none of us have been before. Unfamiliar and therefore dangerous grounds. You two go back the way we came. We've already seen that road and likely haven't missed any clear trail. But we should check everything again. Look towards the forest and the snow in front of it. Search for any sign. Maybe not everything has been covered. Maybe we'll notice something. A piece of cloth on a branch, or a bloodstain on bark. Werner nodded in disappointment, and I saw that he held no hope for the sharpness of our eyes. If only there wasn't snow, Helvig voiced his thoughts. At least then, the tracks would be visible in the ground. But now, if you notice anything, do not think to follow the trail by yourselves, I instructed. It's no use wandering divided through the forest. Check. Make sure you're on a trail, then come straight back. If you find nothing, return as dusk begins to muddle vision. There's no point in searching for tracks in the darkness. We'll spend the night at the Elder's house. Is everything clear? Well, God be with us. Well, God. After inquiring with the grim-faced elder where his house was and ordering preparations for our night's stay, we split up again. Vigard and I directed our horses northward along the forest edge, keenly surveying everything around us from our saddles. The snow had stopped falling from the clouds, but the wind blew from the snow-covered fields, carrying clouds of snow and hurling them into the trees as if they were volleys of arrows against ranks of warriors. The forest stood grim and unyielding, not retreating an inch under this assault. The snowy expanse before us was even, the forest edge untouched, with no trace of any living creature in sight. "What are we to fight against, Gottlieb?" Vigard asked me as we rode away from the village. What kind of beasts could have left such tracks? If only we knew, I replied, no longer hiding my anxiety. If indeed wolves, then one's far larger than usual. And bipedal, Vigard grimly nodded, having come to the same conclusion as I. Do not think me cowardly, my friend, but should we not return for reinforcement? We'd look splendid, standing before our Lord and saying we fled at the mere sight of a dog's track. I shook my head. Wigard fell silent, but it was clear to me that we were not planning to flee far from the tracks of dogs. How can we abandon people here? I asked. We, the warriors of the Lord, bearing his holy cross, how can we retreat, even before the hellish spawns? We, the warriors of the Lord, bearing his holy cross, retreated from Damascus, not before Satan's messengers, but before ordinary men. But we did not abandon the subjects of the German Empire to be torn apart by Nur ad-Din, whom as knights we swore to protect, sparing no life, I replied. Wigard remained silent, but in his silence I heard that I had not convinced him. First, let us determine what the Lord permits, and then we will reason further, I decided. And the warrior nodded in agreement. With each step along the path, it became clearer that no one had traveled this way. Either their tracks were no longer visible, no matter how hard we tried. Moreover, anxiety and doubt grew within me. I increasingly thought that I had made a mistake sending Geltwig and Werner alone. Werner was a brave and hot-headed warrior, both his virtue and his flaw, for he committed deeds that prudent reasoning would have advised against. I was only comforted by the fact that Geltwig feared the forest and the evil within it, and he must have restrained his friend from rash impulses. Yet with each passing minute my anxiety grew, and against my will, the creaky voice of an old woman came to mind. How many lives are you ready to sacrifice to the wolf's jaws? The nights in the north are long, the days short. How far ahead are the marauders of the night? How far have they gone with the abducted peasants? Did they leave anyone behind to watch for pursuit? My soul was restless, and anxiety consumed me. Finally, despairing of finding even a small sign, I waved my hand to Wigard. We turned back. Let's go to the village. Perhaps our young men have found something. If not, then we'll have to resign ourselves. We've missed the prey. The blizzard came, covering the trail. Even hunting dogs lose the scent. There's no shame for us in that. We'll find a new one. Wigard nodded wearily, and we turned back, and I urged my horse on, for anxiety gnawed at me. We returned to the village at twilight, and my anxiety intensified when we did not find our friends in the steward's house. Alwyn, a tall man, set the table without saying a word. He looked grim and inhospitable, but apparently he had sent his family to another house and stayed to serve us. "Why didn't you send your son to us?" I asked, trying to distract myself from bad thoughts. Is there nothing more important for a father than to advise where the strength of his sons is lacking? Isn't the hospitality to our defenders more important? The man replied in his strange manner, barely opening his mouth. But he sent his son early in the morning to the neighboring village, from which you came, Herr Gottlieb, to warn and call for caution. He should return soon. At that moment, Wigard glanced at him, as if he wanted to ask something, but he didn't ask, and I decided that my friend was worried about our comrades just as I was. "They've been gone for a while," I told him. "It's getting dark." He nodded and looked at me inquiringly. "Let's wait a little longer," I replied to his gaze. "If they don't return, we'll go meet them. Alwyn, get us half a dozen torches. I've had enough of the night darkness." The steward left and returned with the torches, but our friends were still missing, and we heard no sound of horses from the street. "Let's go," I decided. But we had just begun to put on our clothes and arm ourselves when the sound of horse snorting and hoofbeats came from the street. My heart clenched, and my soul trembled, and anxiety soared within me like a predatory bird. That gallop was too reckless, too hasty and reckless, and the horse's snorting sounded to me like it was driven and frightened. A few moments later the door burst open, and Geltwig burst into the house. At the sight of him, I realized that my worst fears had come true, for his companion was not following him. The young man's face was pale as wax, his pupils were huge, and in the darkness of his eyes, like in the darkness of the night forest, I saw the shadows of nightmares. His hands and lips trembled as if he could not utter a word, but only groaned lost and strangled, as if invisible hands were squeezing his throat and not allowing him to breathe. I grabbed him by the shoulders and tried to ask him what had happened, but Geltwig could not squeeze out a word, and he stood only because I held him. Then anger rose within me, and shaking him vigorously, I raised my voice. "Pull yourself together, warrior. Is this how a knight should behave? Where is Werner? Where did you leave your friend? In what danger?" Startled by my shout, the young man seemed to surface from an unknown well, seeing the fire's glow in our faces, and it appeared to me that only in that moment did he return from the darkness. Speak up!" Vigard growled, gritting his teeth. "Quickly! We found no tracks." Helvig blurted out in haste. "Not a single one, and I said we should return. But Werner spotted a thicket in the forest and insisted we check it out. I objected. Continue, I urged. There, on the branches of the bushes." Werner saw a tuft of fur, like that of a wolf's. The snow wasn't as deep in the thicket, and a depression led deeper into the forest. Werner decided we should proceed to see if we could find more tracks. Vigard muttered curses behind me, ones that a warrior of the Lord should not sully his lips with. But I did not chide him, for I barely held back the same words myself. And we went on, and we saw signs in the snow, unclear whose, but tracks. I said we should return, but Werner laughed off my fears, saying whoever made the tracks had long since gone, and we needed to make sure we weren't following deer or boars. So we continued, and as it grew darker, I pleaded again to return. But then we came upon a clearing. The young man began to shake again, his lips quivering, his eyes widening as if plunging back into darkness, and I didn't stop him. And Helvig continued in a sing-song voice, as though he were recounting a legend again, but this time about what he had witnessed. Despite the warmth in the room, a chill seized me as I looked into the young man's eyes. The snow in the clearing was trampled, and though it had been covered again, it wasn't enough to hide the blood that was spilled everywhere. At the edge of the clearing, on the trees, there were people, a man and a woman. They were naked and crucified upside down, their hands and feet impaled on broken branches. Their skin was torn, faces and chests ripped apart, bellies slit open, and their entrails hung down, touching the snow. His trembling ceased. He spoke detachedly, as if indeed telling us a tale heard long ago, yet listening was far more horrifying because it all happened today. And then a howl sounded, like that of wolves, but not quite. Wolves do not howl with malice, nor do they howl mockingly, and one cannot hear the anticipation of amusement in the howl of wolves. They emerged among the trees, moving lightly over the deep snow without sinking. Who appeared? Pushing me aside, my companion fiercely shook Helvig. "Speak clearly. Enough with tales." "Werewolves," the young man replied, almost surprised, looking up at Vigard. "Shapeshifters." "Where is Werner?" I asked. Helvig trembled again. "They attacked us and we fought. But our iron didn't wound them, and they weren't afraid of the Holy Cross. And when Werner fell, Vigard suddenly stepped back, looking at Helvig sternly, as if aiming an arrow from a bow. "Draw your sword." The youth looked at him, surprised, then at me. "Draw your sword," I repeated after Vigard, though I didn't understand why he demanded it. The blade hissed and flashed in the firelight, and before I could gasp, Vigard struck the young knight in the cheek. Helvig, already unsteady, was caught off guard by my companion's gauntleted hand, stumbled back against the wall and fell to his knees, his sword clanging to the floor near my feet. "Vigard, what are you doing?" I grabbed my companion by the shoulder, but he had already retreated, as if fearing to do worse to the boy. "Look at the sword!" Vigard hissed, grinding his teeth and clenching his fists. "Pick it up and examine it. Find a single drop of blood, a single strand of fur." I picked up the blade and inspected it. It was impeccably clean, as it should be kept by a worthy warrior, but it should not have remained so immediately after a fierce battle. "Or do you think he stopped on his way here to clean his weapon?" Vigard gasped out. I stepped towards Helvig and laid his sword's blade on his shoulder. The young man raised his eyes to me, filled with shame and tears, but more so with fear, and fear was predominant. And so we stood, as if I were knighting him anew. But now everything was different. "Speak." "Legends say, their steel does not wound them," he whispered. "A man cannot fight the devil's creations. Human weapons cannot overcome Satan's emissaries. You ran. While Werner stayed, I continued for him, unable to contain my disdain. And though he had no hope of defeating the werewolves, he could delay them, giving you a chance to escape. And he did so, dying as a knight and warrior. And you live." Helvig shuddered, but now it was not fear that shook his body and choked him, but grief and shame, and tears streamed from his eyes. I couldn't take off your cloak. "Do not defile the Holy Cross," I said wearily, and he flinched as if from the slap he received, becoming a knight. I turned to Wigard and saw death in his eyes, and there was no need to talk, for everything was clear. Take off your cloak and grab the torches. You'll show the way. Fear flared up in the young man's eyes with renewed force, but he dared not disobey. Alwyn, who had been standing in the corner all this time, obediently bowed when I told him to wait for our return. The fire in the hearth dwindled, and shadows played on his overgrown face, and for a moment I thought he was smirking, but I dismissed those thoughts. There would be time to question the peasant for his insolence. Now there were more important matters at hand. When we mounted our horses, I threw Geltwig his sword, and he caught it, almost dropping it in the snow. There is still time to redeem yourself, or at least conquer your fear, I told him, while Wigard impatiently trotted nearby. Lead the way. We walked as fast as we could, would have even galloped, but the snow hindered us. Moreover, it was impossible to ride horses into the decayed forest, so we tied our steeds to a tree at the edge, where if anything happened to us, the peasants would see them and take them to the castle. Thus, news of our fate would reach our lord, and the place where we entered the forest would be known. However, we did not even consider giving up the search for our comrade, for there was still hope of finding him, albeit exhausted, but alive. As for Wigard, I saw that rage and thirst for revenge drove him forward along the fresh trail, and his sword shimmered ominously in the torchlight. On the other hand, with each new step, Geltwig plunged deeper into the abyss of fear, muttering something incomprehensible under his breath, and looking around anxiously. I must admit, even my heart was not steadfast. The night thickened over the forest. Clouds still obscured the sky and hid the moon, and everything was covered with prickly flakes. The darkness among the trees reluctantly gave way to the light of our torches, and what lurked within it was unknown. But before my eyes, there were large bloody traces in the peasant's house, and my mind obediently depicted a lurking beast in every shadow, in every bush, ready to pounce. "What are you muttering, Geltwig?" I called softly to the young man, hoping to distract him from his fears. "Are you praying for forgiveness or protection?" The knight turned to me over his shoulder, and in his eyes I saw nothing but fear. "They are wolves, Gottlieb," he whispered loudly. "Wolves, plundering packs, and we are sheep, mere sheep, unable to fend off wolves, no matter how many of them gather together. Let's go back. It's not too late." Suddenly Wigard, who was ahead, stopped dead in his tracks and turned to the young man. "It is only in memory of your struggles in the Holy Land, only for the sake of our friendship, that I refrain from cutting you down as a coward and a traitor." He spoke suddenly in a calm and steady voice, but in that voice I felt a raging madness, as I felt the deadly blow in his relaxed posture. "So keep quiet and don't open your mouth, or I won't be able to restrain myself for long." Having said that, Wigard strode off along the trail again, and we followed him in silence. I thought I saw fleeting shadows in the darkness among the trees, but the shadows eluded direct gaze. I drew my sword and ordered Geltwig to do the same, thinking it might hearten him. He obeyed, but even with the weapon in hand, he trembled like a leaf in the autumn wind, and looked fearfully into the darkness of the night forest. We continued like this until the slopes of the decay spread apart, and we emerged into a clearing. Geltwig had not lied to us. The snow here was trampled, and in the torchlight, a considerable amount of blood was visible on the ground. Blood that had congealed and been covered with snow, and freshly spilled and well-marked blood. Walking a little further, Wigard illuminated the bodies of peasants, and I shuddered at what I saw, and was finally convinced that we were following the trail of Satan's offspring, for humans could not commit such atrocities against the innocent. "Werner!" Vigard gasped and rushed forward to the foot of the trees, on which the disfigured bodies were impaled. I ran up to him and saw the body of our comrade, and rage surged in my head, driving away my fears. The blasphemous spawn of hell did not take him alive, but apparently they intended to mock him after death, as his mail shirt and part of his clothing had been torn off. One of his eyes had been gouged out, and along with it, part of his head had been crushed and torn by claws, but his remaining eye looked wicked and merry, as if even in death he found something to laugh about. I heard a quiet growl nearby and looked up, expecting to see a wolfish grin, but I saw a human grin. It was Wigard, grinding his teeth and clenching his fists. Suddenly, he leaped up and shouted into the darkness furiously, "Come then! Come here! Where are you, vile spawn, mangy dogs? Come forth!" I stood by his side, and rage filled me no less than him, ready to throw myself at the werewolves not just with a sword, but even barehanded. And so we stood, scanning in madness for a fight. Only Geltwig looked around in horror, but I no longer noticed him. Then the darkness answered us with a sickening, mournful howl from all sides, mocking and bold. The darkness responded and stirred, moving beyond the circle of light cast by our torches. Behind the trees, behind the crucified, torn bodies, shadows flickered and snow crunched, and throaty howling voices called out to each other. And those voices sounded both like animal growls and human speech at once, yet were muffled and low and indistinct. In the shadows, I could discern figures that seemed like people, but their outlines were strange, as if their arms were longer than they should be, and as if animal muzzles instead of faces were looking our way from the darkness. Vigard nearly rushed into the darkness, but a chorus of howls and the flickering shadows sobered me, and I managed to hold him back. "Snow," I whispered to him. "The snow is deeper there. Their paws are wide. We in armor will sink and get stuck. Death awaits us there. Let's face the fight in the clearing." Vigard growled like a hunting dog straining from the pack and gasping, choking itself, but apparently the fury did not completely blind him. He nodded and took a step back from the edge, and we retreated to the middle of the trampled and blood-soaked clearing. "Back to back," I commanded, and we joined backs. Howling voices rose from the side we had come, making it clear that the way back was cut off. And then the young soul trembled and broke. Geltwig lost his mind, unable to endure the terror that had gnawed at him ever since he heard of the werewolves. Throwing away his sword, which he no longer believed in, he ran into the depths of the forest, past the crucified bodies, into the darkness, screaming prayers he remembered, all jumbled together. "Geltwig!" Vigard shouted and was about to follow, but I held him back again, for the youth was already running through the untouched snow of the wild forest. "No." I jerked my companion by the shoulder. "Snow! We'll die there all three for nothing. Back to back." Vigard looked at me fiercely but obeyed the command, and so we stood in the middle of the bloodied clearing, each with a sword drawn and a torch raised, waiting for the monsters to attack. Geltwig kept running, screaming, and we saw how his feet sank into the snowdrifts, and shadows swirled around him, and the howling drove him further away. Soon falling and sinking into the snow, he lost his torch, and darkness swallowed him. Shortly after, his scream rose and was cut off, replaced by mocking howls. Thus perished the young knight Geltwig, and his body was never found for proper rest. We, however, waited for the beasts in the middle of the bloody clearing, on the edge of which, like dreadful gatekeepers, the crucified and torn bodies of peasants whitened in the darkness. but I felt Vigard's back against mine, and it instilled confidence in me, for my companion was more reliable than any wall. Shadows soon returned, and again howled mockingly, circling around as if conversing in their growling language. The light of our torches danced on our blades, on the bodies of the crucified, on the black branches, and on the bloody stains. And I lost track of time, not knowing how long we stood thus waiting for the strike. "Come on!" I shouted, choking with grief and hatred. "Come on, Satan's spawn! Come and learn why sheep have teeth!" And I shouted more what I now don't remember and cannot recount, and what I do remember I dare not write now, for it is not fitting for a monk to scribe such blasphemies and tarnish his records with them. We shouted together and reviled those who circled in the darkness, calling upon the Lord's wrath upon their heads. But they did not rush at us, not at that hour nor later. And the torches dimmed, and we lit new ones and waited. But only shadows circled around and voices howled, and not one came forth. One came. When the black sky was covered with ash, and it became clear that dawn was not far off, the darkness at the edge of the illuminated circle before me thickened, and from it seemed to grow a tall figure. My eyes were already failing me, but still I strained to see as best I could, and saw that the creature was tall and shaggy, its legs akin to those of humans but ended in wide paws. Its arms were longer than those of people, seemed to have 2 joints, and ended in sharp claws. Its muzzle was wolfish, but in the depths of its dark eye sockets the flame of our torches reflected, and in them I saw malice not animalistic but akin to human. And I noticed a white streak on its muzzle, like a patch of gray in the fur. The werewolf raised a long arm and pointed at me, and a mocking howl erupted from all sides, as if attesting to what had been seen. And then the darkness dissolved in the pre-dawn gloom, and the darkness around us froze, and the sound of the snow ceased. Soon we realized that we were alone in this clearing, and there was no one around, but still we stood back to back, gripping our weapons with numb hands, until the darkness dispersed and dawn broke. We could not carry all the bodies from the clearing, so we only removed the peasants and laid them down as dignified as we could. Werner's body was carried out of the forest and taken to the village, and the foreman was told where to find the bodies of the lumberjack and his wife. Losing 2 comrades in one night, we were stunned and subdued. Returning to the house of the local headman, we sat there, trying to gather our thoughts and understand what to do next, while the headman, having set food on the table, stood silently in the corner, awaiting instructions. Neither I nor Wigard felt like eating. What then? Go back? I asked him, and anger surged in my soul at the thought of it. Seek reinforcements? Eek. I clenched my teeth painfully at the thought of appearing before our Lord and saying that not only had I not fulfilled his will, but I had also lost 2 warriors. That demons had snatched children right from under my nose, and I had shown a horse's tail to Satan's spawn. I could not bear to do such a thing now, but I also did not want to lead my last comrade into a hopeless battle. Go back. My comrade echoed hoarsely, not lifting his gaze from the floor. Go back and leave our friends unavenged. Go back and allow this filth to think that warriors of the Lord can be scared off with howling and dancing. He finally raised his eyes and looked at me, and I almost recoiled from the fury in them. Yes, dear Gottlieb, I myself said that we should seek reinforcements, but that was last night. Now it is morning, and in the meantime, between evening and morning, lies the night that changed everything. I do not see the way home until I redeem my sword up to the hilt in the blood of these damned abominations. We must avenge our friends, not weep fruitlessly. His voice increasingly resembled a growl, and I understood him, for I myself, remembering how we found Werner and lost Geltwig, felt the rage and grief overwhelming me. And I would gladly lead you into battle, Wigard. But what to do if the beasts do not fear iron? How to fight? He raised his eyes to me, and for a moment, surprise replaced the anger on his face. Iron doesn't work. Where did you get that idea from? Geltwig said so. I reminded him. Geltwig, the warrior sighed, shaking his head, was young and believed everything he heard in his childhood. That's why he perished. But you, Gottlieb, where were your eyes? Didn't you see the blood on the clearing? Stung by the reproach, I remembered the clearing at night in the torchlight, remembered the old blood covered with snow, and the fresh blood spilled by Werner. As if only now my eyes had opened, I realized that there was too much blood for just one man, much too much. Werner paid dearly with his life. Do not doubt that, Wigard said, seeing understanding on my face. Or even consider why the creatures did not attack us, if they did not fear iron. Unable to contain myself, I stood up and began to pace the room, like a caged beast. Wigard was right, although I had to admit the obvious and believe in human wolves. Yet not everything that people gossip about is true. Not everything is true. I stopped in the middle of the room, as if struck by lightning. Not everything is true. Not every man. Whose face is human, I whispered, and my hand instinctively reached for the hilt of my sword. For behind me, awaiting instructions, stood the headman. The one with hair overgrown disproportionately, with plenty of gray in it. The one who was tall and secretive, who would not open his mouth unnecessarily, but when he spoke, he would not hide his teeth. The one, I remembered, who sent his son to the neighboring village with news of the robbery. And he knew that a pack of beasts was nearby, bloodied and ready, and night was falling. Yet he did not hesitate to send his offspring and calmly said that he would return in the night. From the neighboring village? Or did he bear news to the pack of beasts by trails known only to him, trails that the warriors had followed to their soul? And as if I stood again on the nocturnal clearing, a shadow coalesced before me. Tall, with a gray streak on its muzzle, the beast pointed at me with an unnaturally long arm, as if throwing down a challenge, or saying that we would meet soon. The unpleasant smirk of the headman flashed before my eyes when we went into the night after Werner. The body of my comrade, almost naked, covered in scratches and wounds, appeared before my eyes, and Geltwig's final scream echoed in my ears, and beyond that, I cannot confidently say what happened next. And then I saw myself standing over the body of the village headman sprawled on the floor, blood and life pouring from his severed neck. His head lay at my feet, looking at me with surprise, lips still tightly clenched in a final effort. The Damascus blade extended from my hand, dripping blood onto the floor, and hot droplets were on my face. While I understand you, Gottlieb, my comrade spoke from behind. It would have been wise to inquire first. Is it him? I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. That's what I thought too, but I didn't want to scare him off. Wigard rose and approached me. He probably thought he had outsmarted us, snitched without fear of retribution. But I think, lift his lips, and you'll see the fangs, Gottlieb, for it's Rudolph, the leader who fancied himself smarter and stronger than us and decided to hide right under our noses. I regret not killing him myself, truly. I knelt down, looking into the dead eyes with astonishment, and placed my hand on the chilling lips. I pulled up, revealing what he had tried to conceal from everyone, who called himself Alvin while he was alive. And at that moment, my heart skipped a beat and froze, and a lump of ice seemed to suddenly appear in my stomach, because I saw firsthand what I did not expect. And behind me, Wigard froze, staring at what was revealed to us, and I thought that although it was not his hand that held the punishing sword, he felt the same coldness in his heart. For there were no fangs beneath the headman's lips, not even strong beastly teeth, but rotten and crooked stumps. Bad teeth, not uncommon among peasants, especially those who had lived through many winters. Alvin did not hide wolfish grins from us, but did not want to offend us with an unpleasant sight. And looking at these crooked, rotten teeth, I thought that it must have been costly for him to send his son to the neighboring village, knowing about the nearby beasts. And couldn't his smirk have appeared to me in the wrong flicker of fire? He was no more secretive than others, whom I had not blindly and foolishly slain before. It turns out that Alvin was only guilty of bad teeth and excessive hairiness. And I, a warrior of the Lord, a knight of the Holy German Empire, sworn to defend its subjects, sparing no effort, I ended his life with my own hand only because, failing to protect my comrades, I found someone to blame for it. I looked up at Wigard but did not see the horror in his gaze that I expected, although the color drained from his face. No fangs, well, he shrugged. But I thought I'd get some answers from his pup. Apparently not meant to be. But apparently the Lord had overlooked us with his attention and favor, for we were destined to make mistakes again and again. At that moment, footsteps sounded behind the door, and it opened, and the eldest son of Alvin stepped across the threshold calling for his father. As he entered, he stopped at the threshold, trying to make out his father's figure in the dim light, but instead saw him dead on the floor, and me beside him with a bloodied blade in my hand. Even in the scant light, it was clear how the blood drained from his face, and how he trembled in fear, recoiling towards the door. I rose to my feet with a heavy heart, intending to admit my guilt and face the consequences. But apparently, my son Alvin interpreted my movement and my grim expression in his own way. "Do not kill me, kind sir." He fell to his knees beside his father's body, pressing his hands to his chest. "Or kill me, just swear not to harm my brother and mother. I'll tell you everything, everything." Still dazed, I did not understand his words, and stood as if deaf. Too much had happened to me this night and morning, my mind could not cope with it. I just watched the youth kneeling before me, just as Geltwig had stood not long ago, and the same plea and fear were evident in his eyes. And everything could have turned out differently if not for Wigard, whose quick wit did not fail him even now. "Speak." He spoke almost gently, approaching the headman's son. "Speak everything or else." With a wide, sweeping motion, he seized the sword, and it hissed menacingly through the air, as if the fury of its master had been transferred to the blade. "With your father I acted hastily, but with you I won't. And then we'll get to the pup. Speak." Wigard's voice sounded cold and calm, but at that moment I understood that he was not joking. And if necessary, even the youngest son of the headman would be next in line. And at that moment I could not say for certain whether I would stop him. Apparently the youth felt the same, because he paled even more, although I did not think it possible. In his fear, he did not even forget that Wigard's blade was clean, and that the blood was only on mine. I will tell. Do not harm my brother, Sir Knight, I beseech you by Christ. Speak." I cut him off. "I swear by the Lord, if you tell everything, neither you nor your family will suffer any harm." "Oh, Father. He would go into the forest at times. He said it was necessary. Otherwise they would come for us." "Where did he go? I can show you." "He showed me the places, told me that if something happened to him, I had to To a predetermined place? Did he send you there when we arrived? The youth nodded fervently, clenching his hands near his chest. Yes. Yes. He was supposed to stay when you arrived. What did he do in the forest? Left a sign, as Father taught. If there were warriors in the village or some other danger, to leave a broken branch on a stone. So you were signaling to the beasts? The youth curled up, hunched on the floor, unable to lift his eyes. It's wrong, but I couldn't disobey. Otherwise they would. And my little brother? You scoundrel, Vigard exhaled heatedly. You warned them about us. He stepped forward, raising his sword, but I grabbed his wrist, preventing him from striking. No, Vigard, it's because of him. No, I said. I swore. The warrior stepped back, trembling with rage, while I approached the youth again. Near that stone, who sees the signs? I cannot know, sir. The steward's son shook his head. I never saw anyone there, and Father never said. I only left the branch, but... Suddenly he lifted his gaze and looked into my face, and I saw in him what I wished to see in Geltwig's face the night before. Behind that stone, the cliffs begin, leading deep into the forest and upwards. They say the wolf's castle stood on the cliff. Right, their lair must be there, Sir Knight. He suddenly sprang forward, reaching out to my feet. You are a warrior of Christ, sir. You can. God protects you. He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw pain and hatred, not towards me, his father's killer, but towards the forest demons that had kept all the nearby villages in fear and collected a dreadful tribute for years. I froze, diving into that gaze, and suddenly realized that there was no turning back for me. A warrior cannot leave without avenging his comrades. A knight cannot walk away, dismissing pleas for help. And one who considers himself human cannot leave children to the despicable creatures of the Lord for blasphemous desecration, which was to be repeated at the next full moon as once before. Death is preferable to dishonor, as has been the custom from time immemorial in the sacred land of the empire upon which it stands. Go, tell about your father, I commanded, and then return. You will lead us to that stone. When the youth left, I turned to Vigard. He looked at me sternly. To execute the pup as soon as he shows the way. No. I gave my oath, and his only fault is that he dared not disobey his father and feared for his younger brother. Are you with me? My companion fell silent, only nodded briefly and said much more than words could. Even if death awaited us there, on the cliff, we had no other path. We walked through the forest for a long time, and the steward's son showed us the signs that led him to the predetermined place. A storm-torn oak, bearing its roots, a blackened tree, struck by lightning. Another tree, bent and twisted. Bark, clawed off. A notable split boulder, and the stone on which the broken branch still lay. Near the stone, I released our guide, ordering him to send word to Valgrim's castle at dawn the next day, should none of us return, that the crusaders sent by him had perished. As he left, we erased our tracks near the stone and moved upwards along the ridge, trying not to reveal our presence in any way. Vigard carried his sword on his shoulder, and I, besides my saber, took Geltwig's sword with me on an impulse I couldn't explain. It seemed to me that the shame could be washed off the blade with the blood of demons, and thus atone, at least in part, for the young knight's guilt. And truly, I do not know whether it was the Lord's instigation or satanic trickery, for this sword played a significant role in what happened next. We moved slowly, hiding as best we could and leaving no traces on the wind-swept rocks. Thus it was getting dark when we arrived at the base of the cliff, on which the ruins towered. First of all, we noticed a half-destroyed tower, which must have been a belfry in a monastery. Its bare stones now blackened in the sky, and the wind drove snow sheets off the cliffs and wrapped the black broken tooth in white shrouds. We found an inconspicuous path at the slope, hidden from the snow by the cliff, and climbed it to the top. Near the base of the destroyed belfry, we saw ancient ruins, but mostly they were just bare walls, worn by wind and weather. In only one place, under the rock wall, we noticed a structure in which the ceiling still remained, and its entrance blackened amid the snows, like a gaping maw from which the howlings of the wind reached us. Glancing at each other, we moved forward cautiously. There was little snow in the ruined courtyard, and our tracks were quickly covered, meaning we couldn't see any werewolf tracks and didn't know if they were here. Yet everything around us was still and quiet, and I didn't sense any living souls nearby. Were the packs roaming the forests, or were the legends lies? Had we found their lair, or just the empty ruins of a burnt monastery? We entered the building stealthily, listening intently, but hearing nothing except the wind. There was hardly any snow on the floor, and it seemed like we had found the monastery's kitchen, but it was empty and abandoned long before our time. "No one here, Wigard," I said, surveying the area. "You were right. We should have questioned the boy more sternly." But he just shook his head and moved deeper into the building. I followed, and the further we went, the more I felt what my friend had likely noticed first: the smell of smoke. Not the stale smoke ingrained in stones, but fresh, living smoke. I confess, a chill ran through me at the thought of what we might find beyond, gates to the depths of hell, from where the spawns of hell emerged. It seemed Wigard was thinking the same, for he suddenly stopped and turned to me with an icy grin on his face. "What do you say, Gottlieb?" he said softly. "Shall we warm ourselves one last time?" He shrugged off his sword, and gripping it more comfortably, moved on, and I unsheathed my blade, following him. At the end, near the wall under the collapsed ceiling, through which the cloudy sky was visible, there loomed a descent into the basement. Without speaking, we descended shoulder to shoulder down the stairs and entered under the low arch. The light here was scarce, and only the walls receding into darkness were visible, but the smell of smoke was unmistakable. Smoke and the scent of fur. Wigard struck his blade against a stone, and the clang echoed under the vaults of the cellar, revealing that the underground extended further into darkness. "We need fire," I sighed. "Too bad we didn't bring torches." "Not needed," Wigard replied. "This is their lair. Can't you smell it? They come from here and will return here. We wait here." I pondered his words. Indeed, the scent left no doubt. It smelled of damp fur, of a beast. It was also true that there was no one here now. But for how long? The creatures would return to their lair, and we shouldn't expect an ambush. I tried to recall how many shadows I had seen in the dark forest this night, but couldn't. However, many there were, we would take 2 or 3 with us, attacking unexpectedly, and then as the Lord permits. They would never feel safe again, and they wouldn't act with impunity. New warriors would come after us if we don't overcome the pack. "We wait here by the entrance," I nodded to Wigard. "When they come, we let a couple in, then strike. Can't let more in. What if the devil granted them the ability to see in the dark? Then 2 blind men will be against a seeing pack." We stood on either side of the entrance, agreeing that I would strike the first who entered, Wigard the second, and then we would cut our way up in the hall, back to back as we had planned in the forest clearing. The ashen light in the doorway dimmed. Fatigue from the sleepless night set in, but a poor warrior succumbs to weakness. So we stood, Wiggard and I, like two sentinels, on either side of the door, and I prayed fervently, though I didn't know if the Lord would hear my prayers, for I had stained myself with the murder of a peasant. He was not without sin, yet I had killed him not for the guilt lying on him, but against honor and conscience. Besides, I blamed myself for the hasty judgment over Geltwig, for wasn't my hasty decision what deprived him of his last protection against Satan's servants? I ordered him to remove the surcoat with the Holy Cross, and possibly that broke his soul, and doomed him to death in the darkness of the night forest. Furthermore, I suddenly remembered, didn't I taint myself with participation in blasphemous heretical divination? You will betray your God and your Lord and yourself, and become hateful to yourself. Runvald's old woman whispered in my ears, as if she stood in a nearby dark cellar. And thrice will you break your oath, she said. Well, I've already broken my oath to protect the subjects of the Empire and to dispense justice. For killing the headman can hardly be called just. How long to wait for the rest? Already now, searching for truth in the words of the vile witch. Am I not offending the Lord? With such thoughts, much time passed, and finally we heard new sounds besides the howling wind and the rustle of snow. Sounds of footsteps. I jolted, realizing I had almost dozed off standing and tensed up. The premonition of a skirmish chased the numbness from my limbs, and sleep's haze fled from me. I sensed more than heard Wigherd readying to strike from the other side of the door. The steps drew nearer, and we could hear muffled voices barking something at each other in fits and starts. Then, footsteps echoed on the stairs. The light in the doorway vanished, and the first shadow slipped into the darkness, followed by a second. And then we began. Many tales circulate about Damascus blades. I'd heard discussions claiming that chainmail and plate armor they cut through as if parchment, but only scoffed. However, Damascus steel indeed is of exceptional quality and slashes splendidly, as it proved once again. With one swing, I decapitated the first. Wigherd, on the other hand, struck diagonally, from below upwards, as his long sword allowed, but his blow was fearsome and lethal, as always, and his opponent died only slightly later than mine. Echoes of blood splashing against walls and floor spread through the cellar. Geltwig was mistaken, and legends misled. Deathly was the steel for beasts, beasts made of flesh and blood themselves, which meant our venture here was not in vain. Having slain the first two, we rushed to the doorway, and there saw another werewolf hurrying up the stairs, fleeing from us. Gripping his sword by the blade, Wigherd threw it like a short spear, intending to stop the beast, and thus buy us a few more moments before the rest realized they had fallen into an ambush. But, though the throw was accurate and pierced the creature's back, it had enough life force to stagger the last steps and burst out above. Without looking back, my comrade extended his hand to me, and without hesitation I placed the Damascus blade in it, and immediately drew Geltwig's sword myself. Thus, side by side, we burst into the dimly lit hall and instantly saw the werewolf, impaled by the long sword. It didn't get far, but it was enough. The creatures recovered from their surprise and lunged at us, and then everything melded into the whirlwind of battle. Though there were no less than half a dozen creatures, I quickly realized why they hadn't dared attack us at night in the meadow, for their movements were clumsy, and they feared to fight face to face. Slash! I roared into the face of the nearest, causing it to recoil, which cost it its life. Wigherd, understanding me perfectly, also leaped forward and cleaved another creature's chest, and I saw that they were about to falter and flee, and already I was searching with my eyes for the werewolf with the gray streak on its snout, to at least cut down the leader. But then I heard a sound I did not expect to hear here, in the beast's lair. A sharp click, and a short whistling hiss, Without thinking, I dove down, ducking under the swipe of the monster, and threw a knife almost blindly, towards the sound, into the vague shadow near the entrance, which now curled up, trying to rearm the crossbow. And God did not turn his face away at that moment, guided my hand true and granted me luck, the likes of which comes only once in a dozen battles. The knife found its target. The shadow twitched and fell backward, the crossbow clattering against the stones, slipping from its vile grasp. I turned in fear, expecting to see my comrade fall, but instead saw how the Damascus blade, almost indistinguishable in the dim hall, in a swift swing, severed the leg of a tall werewolf just above the knee. But I saw no more, catching the blow with the corner of my eye and barely managing to raise my hand. Else the beast would have crushed my head, as it had Werner's the day before. Pain stunned me but also sharpened my senses and propelled me forward. We fell, entwined with the creature in a single embrace, and the world around me became only pain, and fury, and wolf fur, and steel, and growling, and the death rattle, and the taste of blood on my lips, mine and another's. And of the two of us, only I stood up, though the earth pulled me towards it like never before. I looked around, swaying, and realized that in the entire hall now only two stood on their feet, I and Wighard. I managed to meet his gaze, nod encouragingly, and see the wicked smile on his face in return. But then he fell backward, with the same smile on his lips, and the Damascus blade rang on the stone solemnly and sadly, as if a bell tolled for the last time on an ancient ruined bell tower. Feeling no strength in my legs, I approached him and fell to my knees beside him, hoping that if not life, I could at least catch his last words and pass them on to people. But life was no longer in him, and his eyes stared lifelessly, and in his chest, piercing the chainmail, sat a crossbow bolt, deeply embedded, fired by the creature. All his last words he spoke with his sword, and God and I bear witness that these words became the last not only for him alone. Thus died Wighard, a knight of the Empire and a warrior of the Lord, falling in battle with true knightly honor and great valor. Whether he was buried as he should have been, I do not know, for I had no strength to do so on that day, and afterwards fate led me in winding paths, and I had no opportunity to find out. But it seems to me that the cellar of the ancient monastery, purified by his weapon from filth and evil, is a worthy resting place for the knight. And perhaps even to this day, he stands guard beside the bodies of those creatures, clutching his long blade to his chest. I straightened up and surveyed the battlefield. Nearby, a beast snarled and tried to gather its spilled entrails. Without hesitation, I raised my sword and cleaved the vile creature's face in half, steel clinking against stone. Then, remembering the hulking werewolf whose leg Wighard had severed, already fatally wounded, I spun around, surveying, and saw the beast by the wall, where it sat doing something with the severed leg. Hearing my heavy, uncertain steps and seeing death in my eyes, the werewolf raised its paws and howled, and in that howl I distinctly heard the familiar Germanic accent. "No, don't kill me!" the beast howled. "Don't kill!" Then it grabbed its head, clenched its temples, and shook its disgusting muzzle, as if trying to tear off its beastly guise. And it tore it off, throwing the wolf's snout onto the stone floor. And from underneath it a human face looked at me, distorted with pain and fear. "Don't kill, don't kill," he kept repeating. "I'll tell you everything I know." My mind was in turmoil, and I couldn't think clearly at that moment, but I didn't show it. I stopped the blade mid-swing, lowered it to my shoulder, and looked coldly into the face, which now appeared as a vague spot in the gathering dusk of the half-ruined monastery kitchen. The face seemed familiar to me, but the shadows around and the shadows in my mind concealed and hid from me the memories of where I might have seen it, and I had no time for that at that moment. "How will you redeem your life?" I asked. "I lost 3 friends, seeking and cleansing your lair. How do you intend to repay?" With answers, the stranger croaked. "I'll tell you everything. Just don't kill me. You're already bleeding out." I mercilessly nudged him with my foot towards the severed limb. He whimpered. I tied it, tightened it with belts, stopped the bleeding. "But you'll help me tighten it more and get to the village. And I'll tell you everything I know. Swear you won't kill." "What use is that to me?" "I can extract all the answers from you with my sword." "And how will you know the truth? If I'm already dying, why should I tell you the truth? Swear you'll spare me." Questions crowded my mind, thoughts tangled, and I had no strength to seek answers. And so my deliberations were brief. "I swear by the Lord, if you tell me everything you know, I'll help you with your wound and get you to the village, and then I'll take you to Lord Valgrim's castle for judgment. But if I catch you in a lie, I'll cut you down without hesitation. Ask." He had lost a lot of blood, and his clothes were damp from it, so he shook with chills. "Ask your questions, I'll tell you everything. Name yourself." "Rudolph is my name." I sighed and shook my head, preparing to swing the sword again, but the stranger raised his hands, shielding himself. "No, no, it's true. That's my name." And then laughter almost overcame me, though it was inappropriate to indulge in merriment now. But it occurred to me that Forsyth knows how to joke much funnier than court jesters and buffoons. Apparently, indeed, the one who decided to dress up as a werewolf from legends was truly called Rudolph. "Where are the children?" "You won't catch up to them." He shook his head. "They were sold immediately after they were taken. By now, they must have been sold." "To whom?" My thoughts began to clarify, and I wasn't surprised by his answers. "How should I know? We don't sell, only deliver. But there's always demand for youths and girls and even small children." He grinned like a beast. "Some for pleasure and some for... Nearby is Pomerania, where heathen wens live, ignorant of the cross. There are rumors that buyers can be found there." I looked around, lost, trying to fit into my thoughts that I was not hunting and killing hellspawn, but slave traders, whom I thought we had long eradicated from the lands of my lord. Nearby lay the wolf mask with a white stripe on its snout. Why all these disguises? At first, we managed without them, but peasants aren't as afraid of brave men as they are of werewolves. Rudolph grinned again. "A couple of times they almost attacked us with axes and pitchforks, barely got away. And then we remembered the local legends." He laughed, as if choking, and leaned back against the wall. "We trapped the local wolves in snares and pits, made masks and clothes, weapons from claws and fangs. These paws to make the tracks scarier." He grimaced, kicking with a broad paw at his ankle. "The people got scared. Can you believe it? Some even handed over their children in the woods just to save themselves." "Who's calling the shots?" "Who's to say?" croaked Rudolph. "Once, as I heard it, all matters were handled through the overseer in the castle. But then he disappeared, quickly replaced though. We were given orders and instructions through secret paths. There are those in the villages here who agreed to serve out of fear for their lives." "I know," I said coldly. "But you seem to know very little, as far as I can see." "A meager ransom. I'm starting to regret promising to help you." "It was the last order," he sighed, trying to get more comfortable on the cold stone. "The last one was different from the others." I remained silent, waiting. Sometimes we received messages indicating exactly who was needed, a boy or a girl, and how many winters. But the last order was different. Rudolf hurriedly spoke, his teeth chattering. Not a child or a youth, but a knight someone wanted. A crusader knight with a crooked sword. Triple the reward for his head. And the crossbow with that order was handed over. My head spun, and involuntarily I took a step back from the prisoner, looking towards the entrance where one of the kidnappers lay in a dark heap. And next to him, the crossbow that had killed Wigard. The crusader knight with a crooked sword. You're cunning. The man coughed out a raspy laugh, tightening the belt around his severed leg, holding on to life and blood in his veins. I gave the blade to someone else. That's why you got mixed up. If I had the crossbow, I wouldn't have mistaken you for anyone else. I saw you then, in the clearing. Why didn't you kill? They're in the clearing? I turned to him, feeling hatred and rage overwhelming me. It wasn't in our interest, Rudolf sneered. That lumberjack, he needed to be taken care of long ago. Too audacious. He incited others to resist us. We waited for you for 2 days, so we decided to instill fear one last time, so that the people wouldn't stick their noses out of their homes, so they wouldn't spoil our hunt. Go on. I approached him again, gripping the sword more comfortably. It didn't go as planned, the prisoner continued. We sent the children to a safe place. 4 of them left with them. The rest stayed in the clearing with the lumberjack and his wife to have some fun. They had a great time with the living and the dead, even lost track of time, and then your friends arrived. Rudolf raised his head and looked at me. And then I made a mistake, he said weakly. I thought we could easily handle 2 against a pack. And when the lad showed his back, I lost all caution, though I could have recognized who I was dealing with. That warrior killed 2 of us, wounded the 3rd so badly he later gave his soul to God. Then I should have ordered to come back here for the crossbow, but I thought we had instilled enough fear in you. Never thought you'd come to the forest that night. But you did. There was a hint of respect in Rudolf's weakening voice. I was already learned, he continued. I knew we couldn't catch you in the clearing, but I hoped to drive you into the snow. We would have been much more agile on these paws. Would have divided and killed you somehow. But that didn't work out either. Only the boy lost his head. So I took my people. We came here immediately, rested, bandaged our wounds. We saw the sign left by the locals, only too late. And by morning, those who had taken the children returned, and we, with our own paths and the crossbow, headed for the inn. Now he looked down and smiled, shaking his head. I thought you'd run away by now. 2 against a pack. Who would be stupid enough to fight? I planned to intercept you on the way back. Hoped to put an arrow in your heart myself. And the other one we'd deal with somehow. The snow was piled up nicely. Even a horse would have a hard time against us. And the crossbow was at hand. There wasn't an order to kill you both. Just your head was demanded and valued 3 times as much as usual. But for the rest, they still paid a price if we managed to kill them. He sighed and tightened the belt around his severed leg again, grimacing. But even there you outsmarted me. Whether you're incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, that's what I'll say. But God must really love you. And now help me, knight. I have nothing else to tell. Who killed the knight in the clearing? I didn't move. I did. Rudolf bared his teeth. I was so angry then, and I was still hot from the fun with the peasants. I wanted to play with his body too, but you ruined the fun. And I killed the boy too, took his soul. And now help, knight, fulfill your oath, as you people are used to doing. In that moment, I realized that Gottlieb of Havelberg, a knight of the Empire and a warrior of Christ, a crusader and a faithful vassal, had died. He died here, in the ruined monastery, falsely called Wolf's Castle. I took a step back from Rudolph, and bending down, laid my blade on the stone floor. The prisoner watched me with a wicked smirk, expecting help and the fulfillment of an oath. I, wincing from the pain in my wounds, took off my surcoat, stained with blood, and covered the body of Wigard with it, then returned to my sword and picked it up. Surprise slid across the bandit's face, but he neither had the chance to act nor speak. Damask steel does not cut through armor and chainmail. That's a fairy tale, just like werewolves are only in fairy tales. Yet, there is a grain of truth in fairy tales, as there are those who bear a human visage. So there is truth in the tales of Damascus steel, for it cuts splendidly. Both wrists that were adjusting the strap on a severed leg were cleanly and smoothly cut off by the blade, and they fell to the floor like bloated pale spiders. The prisoner howled not with his own voice, in horror watching as the remnants of his life left him. "You swore! You swore!" he screamed, writhing on the floor in a pool of blood, weakening with every moment. Then the screams turned into truly wolfish howling and animal whining. But it soon quieted down, leaving the wind to howl alone in the holes of the half-destroyed roof. Thus, for the second time, I broke the oath I had given, and thus I understood where I was destined to break a third. And I understood where my path now lay, which the seer had prophesied to me. However, I did not leave the ruins before I decently placed Wigard's body in the basement and put the long sword in his hands. And there, in the basement, evidently my strength left me, for I collapsed into darkness, and only emerged from it when the daylight was again visible in the doorway. I left the ruins of the monastery, taking with me a crossbow and a wolf mask, the gray of which turned out to be hearth ash. To not overly tire the reader with the description of the return journey, I will only say that I reached my lord's castle only by the following night, and the darkness that enveloped the lands of the Mark was only to my advantage. As I mentioned before, I was well known at the castle and considered the right hand of my lord, so it was not difficult for me to reach his chambers, and the guard at the doors stepped away at my signal, casting a surprised look at the crossbow in my hand. However, I had come to the lord armed before, and evidently they reasoned that I had serious reasons to appear before Valgrim with a weapon. Entering the chambers, I found my lord sleeping in his bed, his sleep troubled, and a strong wine scent wafted through the room. A broken pitcher lay next to the bed, surrounded by a crimson pool, as if blood had been spilled. I did not wake my lord, but sat tiredly on a bench against the wall, laid the cocked crossbow on my knees, and put on the wolf mask over my face, thus hiding it from my longtime ally and ruler. Apparently, my lord retained his warrior's instinct, despite his debauched life, so I didn't have to wait long before he stirred heavily among the furs, grumbled, and then sat up in bed, stepping into the puddle of spilled wine with his foot. "Who's there?" "Who?" he growled gutturally, trying to stand on unsteady legs and peering into the night's gloom. Seeing me, he flinched, but then quickly became enraged, showing no great surprise, and my heart sank. And in that moment, I realized that I had not erred and had judged correctly, and had come where I should. "You?" "Rudolph," Valgrim growled, rising and holding onto the bedstead to keep from falling. "How dare you? You?" But then his eyes fell on the crossbow lying on my knees, and his fury vanished as if a lamp had been extinguished by a blast of icy wind. He said softly. "It's done. Did he suffer?" I sat silently, unable to answer the one I considered my friend and lord, for the lord had taken my tongue and drained strength from my limbs, and abandoned me. and suddenly I realized that it was no accident he had begun to drink so much wine lately. "Well?" Valgrim prodded, raising his voice. "Speak, you cur, when your lord asks, and take off that filth from your face. It was said not to appear in masks in the castle. Have you lost your fear? Take it off." As if not of my own volition, my hands moved, and the wolf mask with the gray streak of ash on the fur fell to the floor. And for a long time, a very long time, my friend and lord, ally and ruler, looked upon my face. Then he sat heavily on the bed and lowered his head, sitting thus, looking at his hands, until my voice returned to me. "How did this come to pass, Valgrim?" I asked, as if hearing myself from afar. "How did you doom us to death when there was no one closer to you than us?" He remained silent, clenching and unclenching his fists, his head shaking from side to side as if trying to deny everything that had happened, which I now understood was by his own will. "And the children, Valgrim? The children. You yourself are a warrior of Christ. The children," he suddenly exclaimed, lifting his head. "The children. And where are my children, Gottlieb? I, a warrior of Christ, sprinkled the Holy Land with blood in his name. I left friends there in my health, and what did I find in my own home? Where was God? What do I care now for other people's children? You yourself put an end to the overseer for dealing in slavery." "Yes, I did," he growled, lowering his head again. And then I reconsidered. The money was good, the income reliable. It was easy to find the right people. At first I thought I'd make amends, and that would be enough, but then... Why not, Gottlieb? There's no longer any belief in God or the devil within me. I know we are alone here, among the snows and blood. What have I done to you, my lord, that you wish to see my blood on the snow? You, he growled, clenching his fists. Your condemning face at every feast, your prayers and piety, the virtuous Gottlieb, warrior of Christ, a rebuke to me in all days of merriment and idleness, and besides... He rose, staggering, and paced heavily around the room. Did you think I didn't see how you looked at the guests, at Rudolph? Sooner or later, you would have learned of my deeds, and then I saw how skilled you were with the blade, and the other knights listened to you and respected you as their elder. And then I understood why the face of the false werewolf seemed familiar, and I remembered where I had seen him before. That's why my prisoner spoke so willingly when I threatened him with my lord's judgment. He dared not hope for such fortune. Evidently, Valgrim's guilty conscience spurred his suspicions against me, leading him to believe I was a threat to him personally. You were both a rebuke and a threat to me, Valgrim confirmed, turning to me. I could no longer keep you close without fear. But I did not want your blood on my hands. I did not wish your death to cast a shadow over my house. So I sent you away and ordered my men to meet you and kill you. But you foiled all my plans by leaving 2 days earlier than agreed. Apparently, that's why you're still alive. My lord stopped at the foot of the bed and turned to me, spreading his arms. "And now what, Gottlieb?" he asked, seemingly weary. "You swore loyalty to me, and knowing your piety, I also know that you cannot bring yourself to kill me. I, too, cannot raise my hand against you. But what now?" I stood up and we looked into each other's eyes in silence, feeling even what remained of the pious Gottlieb from Havelberg dying within me forever. "You asked if I suffered before death," I said, and my voice was dead, as if not I was speaking, but a lifeless, cold body. I did suffer, old friend. Although I considered the crossbow a despicable and unworthy weapon for a knight, every person who counts themselves among warriors must be proficient with all weapons. and we stood too close for me to miss. Valgrim, seeing me raise the crossbow, realized what awaited him. His eyes widened in terror, and a scream, more like a howl, escaped his chest. But that howl was short-lived. The crossbow bolt struck him in the neck, piercing his throat and shattering his vertebrae. And he fell backwards onto the furs that covered the bed, where he breathed his last. Thus, for the third time, I broke my oath, and thus died Valgrim, knight of the Empire and warrior of the Lord. And there was no honor in his death, as there had been none in the last years of his life. I placed the wolf mask on his face, so that those who found the body would see the true visage of one who became not a shepherd to his flock, but a wolf. And then I left the home of the man I once called my lord forever, fleeing into the night, as befits an oath-breaker and murderer. And the echo of the last werewolf's howl rang in my ears as I walked through the dark corridors. As I walked the night road away from the castle I had considered my home for so many years, a pale, deathly light struck my back, casting my vague shadow at my feet. I turned around, and above the black mass of the castle, amid the parting clouds, I saw the silver circle of the full moon, and so Wolf's Castle remained in my memory. My paths thereafter were unclear and rugged, and I will not enumerate all their hardships. I will only say that 2 long years later in Pomerania, on the banks of the Peene River, I met monks who were building a new abbey in the lands of the pagans. And I joined them, sparing no effort to help, and thus spent the winters allotted to me by the Lord among them, taking the vows and adopting the name of the order's founder, Saint Benedict. But that is another story, which I shall not weary those reading these lines with. Such is the story of Gottlieb from Havelberg, now known within the walls of Stolp Abbey as Brother Benedict, and as I finish writing it, I feel my very life coming to an end. The story of the search for Wolf's Castle, though it seems concluded, continues to this day and will likely never end. For as many centuries as may pass, there will always be those who, despising divine and human laws, will reject their humanity and turn into wolves in their souls. Remember this.